All right, so today we're going deep, really deep, into a question that has had philosophers and scientists, well, kind of scratching their heads for centuries.
Yeah.
Can this idea of emergence actually explain free will?
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is, and luckily we've got this chapter that's going to help us unpack it.
Okay.
So maybe we should start with like a little Emergent Properties 101.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, what is emergence, really?
Well, on the surface, it seems pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have all these basic parts, these simple parts.
Yeah.
And they're all just interacting.
Okay.
And then, boom, all of a sudden you have this complex behavior that you couldn't have really predicted just from those parts.
Yeah,
right?
are we talking ant colonies here?
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about an ant colony. Each little ant on its just doing its own thing, right?
Right.
But all together, they create these intricate patterns.
Right.
They solve all these problems. It's incredible.
It is. Or like those slime molds.
Yeah, slime molds are another good example.
Just like doing their thing.
They create these beautiful patterns.
Yeah.
And it all comes from these simple little cells.
It really does seem like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Right.
But, okay, so how does all this connect to the whole free will thing?
Right. Well, the chapter talks about how a lot of people find this connection really appealing, I think, because the idea that free will emerges from the brain kind of allows us to hold on to this belief that we have choice, that we have autonomy.
Right, even if the world is governed by all these physical laws.
Exactly. It's like we're not just these robots, you know?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Our brains are more than just a bunch of neurons firing.
Right, we're special.
Yeah.
But the chapter doesn't exactly make it easy for us, does it?
It doesn't.
It kind of throws some major roadblocks at us, you know, with this whole free will and emergence thing.
Oh, yeah. It definitely lays out some problems with that idea.
Yeah, problems.
And the first problem it tackles is this tendency we have to mix up unpredictability with indeterminism.
Okay, break that down for me.
So just because we can't easily predict something doesn't automatically mean it's not determined by some underlying causes.
Wait, so even if our brains are doing all these complex things, we can't predict them.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean our choices are actually free.
Exactly. That's the big point.
Like, we're still bound by the physical world and all that.
The author uses this analogy.
Okay, hit me with it.
It's like mistaking estrogen for testosterone.
Whoa, okay, going there.
Because they have similar structures, but obviously they're going to lead to very different outcomes.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see how that applies.
Right. Just because a system is complex and we can't totally predict how it's going to behave doesn't mean it's not operating within certain boundaries.
Okay, I get it. Yeah, it's not just a free-for-all in there.
Exactly.
And I feel like this connects back to what we were talking about before with those chaotic systems.
Oh, absolutely. You remember how we talked about how tiny little changes in the initial conditions can lead to these massive, unpredictable outcomes?
Right, like the butterfly flapping its wings.
Really classic example.
And then, boom, hurricane on the other side of the world.
Exactly, and that's the point here.
So just because something is hard to predict, it doesn't mean it's not determined by something.
It just means it's complicated, and there are a lot of factors at play.
Okay, so unpredictability does not equal free will. Got it.
Exactly.
But what's the next thing, the next hurdle this chapter throws at us?
Well, the next issue is all about those building blocks themselves. The components that make up these emergent systems, you know?
Yeah.
The chapter introduces this idea of weak emergence.
Okay, what's that?
Where the emergent behavior, how the system behaves, is ultimately still limited by what those individual parts can actually do.
So no matter how complex a system gets, how fancy it gets, it's still kind of stuck with what its parts can do.
Okay, so give me an example.
Like an ant colony, right?
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't matter how sophisticated that ant colony becomes. Those ants are still limited by what individual ants can do.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right.
It's like our brains, even if consciousness or decision-making are these emergent properties, they're still ultimately grounded in what neurons can do.
Exactly. They can't just magically do anything they want.
Right, they're still neurons.
The chapter contrasts this with this other idea of strong emergence.
Ooh, okay, what did that?
Where those emergent properties somehow just completely defy the constraints of their building blocks.
Whoa, hold on. That sounds kind of like magic almost.
It kind of is, right?
Yeah.
The author points out that kind of strong emergence,
Yeah.
it's basically like magical thinking.
Like expecting a pile of bricks to just build themselves into a house?
Exactly. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So we're back to this idea that even with emergence, we're still bound by those limitations of the physical world. Okay, yeah, it's a good reality check, I guess.
Right. We can't just wish away those limitations.
But there was one more problem, right?
Oh, right. We can't forget about that.
The chapter mentioned something about downward causation, didn't it?
Ah, yes. Downward causation. This is where things get a little trippy.
Yeah, buckle up, everyone.
It's this idea that the emergent properties, those high-level things, they can actually influence the behavior of the individual components that make them up.
Whoa, so it's like a loop.
Right. It's not just bottom-up.
The whole thing's influencing the parts.
The whole is influencing the parts, mind-bending, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
And the chapter highlights this really cool study from 2005 that shows this.
Ooh, I think I remember reading about this one.
It shows how social conformity, peer pressure, can actually influence neuron activity in the visual cortex.
Whoa, wait. So like what people are telling you is changing how your neurons are firing.
Exactly.
That's wild.
And that's downward causation in action, the emergent property, that social pressure.
Yeah.
Is influencing those individual neurons.
Okay, that is crazy.
So if social conformity can change how neurons are firing, it makes you wonder, does that mean our thoughts, our choices, could also be shaped by these emergent properties?
It really does, yeah. Like how much control do we actually have?
Right, but the chapter makes it clear.
Yeah.
We shouldn't just assume that downward causation means these emergent properties can just defy the nature of their components,
So it's not like they can just rewrite the rules of the game.
Right. They can't just make neurons do things they're physically incapable of doing.
Right. They can't suddenly make them speak French.
Exactly. It's a good analogy.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Like, just because an ant colony can figure out how to find food doesn't mean those individual ants suddenly gain superpowers.
Okay, so downward causation is happening. But it's not giving the individual parts magical abilities.
Right.
It's more like setting the stage for them to operate in.
Exactly. It's influencing the context.
Okay, that clarifies things a bit.
Yeah, it's a subtle but important distinction.
Before we move on, can we just quickly recap the three big problems with this whole free will and emergence thing?
Sure, yeah. So first, there's that tendency to confuse unpredictability with indeterminism.
Okay, got it.
Just because something's unpredictable doesn't mean it's not operating within some determined boundaries.
Right, like those chaotic systems we talked about.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the second one?
Second, we've got the limits of those building blocks,
Right, the parts can only do so much.
Even with these emergent properties, the system's still limited by what those individual parts can do.
Okay, and third?
And then, of course, there's downward causation, which is super interesting.
It is.
But it doesn't change what those building blocks are,
Right, it's just influencing how they operate, the environment they're in.
Exactly. It's all about the context.
Okay, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around all this.
Good.
But it still leaves us with this huge question, like, if emergence doesn't really explain free will, then what else is there?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It's like, we hit a dead end.
Oh, not exactly a dead end, more like a fork in the road.
Oh, okay, tell me more.
The chapter actually goes into some alternative explanations.
It does.
Yeah, in the next section.
All right, you've got me hooked.
Get ready. Things are going to get even more mind-blowing.
I am so ready for this. Let's do it.
Let's dive in. So, before we kind of jump into those other explanations, there's one more thing about emergence that I think we should touch on.
Okay, what's that?
Well, you know how we've been saying those emergent properties are limited by their building blocks?
Yeah.
The chapter really emphasizes this point.
Okay.
Even as systems become more complex, more unpredictable, they're still fundamentally shaped by the nature and history of their components.
So no matter how fancy the system gets, it can't totally escape where it came from.
Exactly. It's like,
Is there an analogy coming?
Yeah, it's like a tree.
Okay.
With all these branches reaching for the sky, but its roots are still firmly planted in the ground.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really paints a picture.
Right.
So even if we're talking about consciousness or free will,
Yeah.
those emergent properties are still grounded in the physical stuff that makes up our brains.
Exactly. We can't just forget about those fundamental building blocks.
Right.
Not when we're trying to understand these complex things.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most profound insights come from paying attention to those little details.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what makes this chapter so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just throwing out these abstract ideas.
Right.
It's grounding them in concrete examples and showing how these concepts actually play out in the real world.
Speaking of concrete examples,
Yeah.
was there anything else that stood out to you? Anything that really sparked your curiosity?
Well, one thing I found interesting was this idea of strong downward causation.
Okay, yeah, I remember that.
The author comes back to that concept.
Yeah.
And points out that even if strong downward causation does exist, it's probably not as radical as some people might imagine.
So it's not like these emergent properties can suddenly rewrite the laws of physics or give those neurons superpowers.
Exactly. The chapter argues that even in the case of strong downward causation, it's more likely influencing the context in which things operate, not fundamentally changing what they are.
So it's like saying emergent properties can set the stage, but they can't change the actors in the play.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, cool.
It highlights a really important nuance in this whole debate about emergence and free will.
For sure. It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Right.
But I'm still really curious about those alternative explanations you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to get to explore those.
Oh, yeah, we are. The next chapter takes us on a wild ride.
Okay. Lead the way. I'm ready to see where this deep dive takes us next. So we've spent a lot of time on this whole emergence thing.
We have.
And it seems like, well, it doesn't quite give us all the answers about free will.
Doesn't quite get us there.
You mentioned some alternative explanations, though.
Yeah. The next chapter goes into some really interesting stuff.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
Well, up until this point, we've been thinking about a deterministic world, right?
Right. Like everything that happens is a consequence of, what happened before.
Exactly. Like a chain reaction.
Yeah. It can make you feel kind of trapped, like a cog in a giant machine.
I get that. And that's exactly what this chapter challenges.
Okay. So what, are we going full quantum physics now?
Hold on tight. It does get a little mind-bendy.
Okay. I'm ready.
So the chapter doesn't go deep into specific theories or anything, but it suggests that, maybe the world isn't as rigidly deterministic as we think.
So are we talking about randomness?
Yeah, like maybe our choices aren't completely predetermined.
Huh. Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
There's a big shift.
So instead of our brains being like well-oiled machines,
yeah,
they're more like dice rolls?
That's a good way to think about it.
Where the outcome is like totally uncertain?
Exactly. And this randomness, this indeterminacy,
yeah,
could be the key to understanding how we have freedom.
But if our choices are influenced by randomness, does that really make us more free or just less predictable?
That's a great question. And it's one philosophers have been debating for ages.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a tricky one.
Does true freedom require complete control?
Right.
Or is there freedom in embracing the unpredictable?
It's deep stuff.
The chapter doesn't give a definitive answer.
Yeah.
But it does make you think.
It definitely does. So after this journey through emergence, chaotic systems, and the nature of reality itself.
Yeah, it's been a ride.
What's the takeaway here? Where do we go from here?
I think the biggest thing is that this whole question of free will, it's not settled.
It's not just a yes or no.
Not at all. There's so many layers, so many perspectives to consider.
So many paths to explore.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting about all this.
Yeah.
This chapter really encourages us to embrace the mystery.
The mystery.
To keep asking questions.
And searching for a deeper understanding.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. If the world is more unpredictable than we think,
more random,
what does that mean for us?
For who we are.
And the choices we make.
It's something to ponder.
It is. Until next time, fellow deep divers.
Keep those minds curious.
And those